Brett Marden will give the first presentation on Artemia resilience in response to dramatic changes in the GSL salinity and volume. Brett, you have the floor.
All right, well, it's nice to be here, and appreciate everyone who's in the audience. I've seen some familiar faces that I haven't seen in quite a few years, so that's a real pleasure to see those of you who I've shared some time with working on Artemia. And I appreciate Patrick's introduction. He did add one extra term in there, and that was dramatic. Dramatic changes in Great Salt Lake salinity and volume. So we have had some changes in the Great Salt Lake and some rather interesting weather patterns that we're going to look at, and then the Artemia response to it. I'm going to put these all out here at once. They shouldn't be scrolling through like that. Before I move on, I want to make sure that everyone in the audience is aware that when we talk about the Great Salt Lake, there's two arms. There's the north arm and the south arm, separated by a rock causeway where there is, depending on the year, there is more or less bidirectional flow across from the north arm to the south arm and vice versa. And when there is that bidirectional flow, if there is the heavy saturated brine from the north arm into the south arm, it can establish what we term the monomnolimnion, or a deep brine layer. And the next speaker, Phil, will talk about this in greater detail. But it's going to become important when I'm discussing kind of some of the things we've observed in terms of dormancy of the cysts, recognizing that there may have been some influence by that deep brine layer and the loss thereof. So just a little background on the lake. But in any case, cyclical patterns of weather has been something that we've seen for the last 170 years on the Great Salt Lake. There are times of drought, times of high levels of precipitation. But in particular, this time period from 2020 to 2024 was very interesting because it ushered in extremes of both. Very severe drought followed by tremendous amount of precipitation. And during this time period, we've had the opportunity to take a look at how the Great Salt Lake is, well, the extent to which it may be vulnerable to these weather changes and the rate at which it will or will not recover. So kind of a vulnerability index from those years. On this slide, we're looking at time period from 2001 to 2024, so 25-year time period from 2000. Over that, there have been 5 periods of drought. You can see the kind of drought categories here from yellow all the way to this deep sort of almost brownish maroon color, and that's being exceptional. The percentile range for those categories is listed in this table. And you can see that in the most recent drought, we reached that exceptional level. So right in here, so in 2021, and that is for the state of Utah, large portions of it were in this exceptional drought. Now just kind of zooming in, a snapshot of Utah in 2021 compared to 2024, there's a very dramatic difference. So we've gone from this exceptional or extreme drought condition to even some regions of the state where it's not in a drought or it's just abnormally dry. So a very big transition. In these two graphs, there's a long history of recording the lake elevation. So in the lower graph, this is going all the way from the 1800s to the present, and it kind of picks up the maximum lake elevation that happened in 1986 at 4212. And I apologize, this is in feet above sea level, so feet above sea level, maybe a different should be converted to meters, but nonetheless, that's the standard. And then the low point, which was reached in 2022 at 4190. And for this talk, I'm focusing on this kind of time period in here, these 5 years where we had the drought, we had decreasing lake elevation, and then increasing lake elevation with this high precipitation event in 2023 and 2024. And the two graphs up here are the south arm and the north arm. Coinciding with that change in elevation, of course, there's going to be a change in salinity. So sort of the long-term government program of monitoring salinity on the lake, it picks up the high inflow year from 1983 to 1986, where salinity drops substantially and carries it to about 2022. The graph on the right is our own data. This is from 2016 to 2024, and we're looking at the salinity increase in this time period of drought, and then quite a rapid decline in salinity, reaching down to the current, which is at 117 grams per liter is the present measurement. And so, with respect to the Artemia, from what we've seen over the years, we've kind of put these bookends on salinity that we believe favors robust growth of the Artemia or pushes it out into risky categories. At the low end, the risk is below 90 or below 80 to be sure. At that point, there's a greater potential problem with charixids taking over the lake. And the upper end, clearly when it gets around 170 or over 180, that's where we see a lot of decline. So there is concern about what can happen with these changes in salinity. So during this time period, 2020 to 2024, 2021 to 2022, the severe drought, what happened? Lake level went down, salinity went up, osmotic stress of the aquatic organisms was certainly increased. An interesting thing about the Great Salt Lake, it has a variety of kind of benthic environments, but a critical one for nutrient cycling and primary production is this very large surface area attributable to these microbialites, these calcium and magnesium carbonate structures that provide kind of ideal habitat. A lot of those were exposed to desiccation and UV light as the lake went down. There's quite a bit of concern that that's going to change primary production on the lake. And then at the larger ecosystem level, Great Salt Lake is a tremendous site supporting a variety of migratory and resident birds. Some of those birds that nest on the islands abandoned those nesting sites in 2021 and 2022. So it looked grim from some perspectives. But then we just moved forward 2 years, 2023 to 2024, and it's a huge change. Salinity is back into a favorable range. The primary and secondary production rates were really quite tremendous. And the people who've been studying those microbialite structures are recognizing that the recovery of those is quite a bit more rapid than they had anticipated. And the birds have recolonized some of those nesting sites. So there's very rapid recovery taking place at multiple levels within the kind of trophic structure of the lake. Now, sort of shifting the focus to Artemia, we want to look at population dynamics, reproductive output and its timing, some interesting changes in dormancy, and then from our commercial point of view, harvest outcomes. But before I move right on to kind of the results that we have, I just wanted to point out that we've had a systematic sampling program on the lake since 1999, and if my calculations are correct, we should be approaching our 480th time out there. We typically do 9. We used to do 12 sites. Each time we go out to 9 different locations and do a full limnological assessment of those sites. So it's quite a bit of work, and it's a pretty extensive database. I think it illustrates kind of the passion we have for protecting the lake, not just for our commercial point of view, but from the overall ecosystem maintenance and trying to provide a good foundation of scientific research on it. So, so what happened with those high salinity years? A couple of things. Clearly, it shifted the onset of hatching. We had high salinity, low input of fresh water in the springtime, and that pushed the hatching back. And I want to point out the way all these graphs are going to appear. The year that we're talking about, the focus year, is going to be in red. There will be a range of years that it's compared to. That's the black line. We'll have the maximum and minimum and the 25th and 75th percentile. So all the graphs after this will follow that same pattern. And I'll indicate which years we're comparing it to. But this was 2022 compared to 94 to 2021. And we see kind of a delay in the onset of hatching. This is an overall population biomass. And based on some of our work on hatching, which indicates that anything above 110 to 115, we're not getting any emergence or hatching. And so it was no surprising during that time period that we had some delays until the incoming water had provided at least some pockets of lower salinity water. The other thing that kind of changed with that high salinity is we saw an earlier shift to oviparous reproduction. So because Artemia can alter their reproductive mode, we usually track the pattern of Initially, it may even be dominated by ovoviviparous reproduction. Later, usually somewhere in July, late June or July, it shifts to oviparity. We saw that shift early on in 2022. And then just looking at kind of the outcome of that shift was really very large brood sizes. So that in 2022, we're approaching the maximum measured brood sizes for cysts. So it indicated that that high salinity stress really kind of altered their pattern of reproductive mode. But very interestingly, is something to do with the dormancy. So every time we go out on the lake, we collect cysts, we bring them back, we do our very best to not alter them at all, hatch them out right away, and just trying to get an as-is assessment of embryo viability and hatching patterns. And the typical thing is, and this graph above is 2013 to 2023, and we're looking at seasonal differences. So as usually in January, February, the cysts are at their maximum hatching potential. It's usually 84% to 91. As spring arrives, the viable ones hatch. Obviously, overall, those that are remaining are somehow resistant to hatching. Then we have the next generation, production of dormant cysts, and it brings the overall hatching usually down into the single digits. So that's the pattern that we typically see. But in 2021 and 2022, we did not see that pattern. So we never really got down into those low single digits, indicating that it was a uniform population of dormant cysts. It just didn't quite happen like that. The graph down here is just kind of illustrating the same thing, just taking, this is 2018 to 2019, but just kind of showing that sigmoidal relationship that happens. Midsummer, single digits hatching, environmental conditions usher in termination of diapause, and then it reaches the high levels going into the winter, sort of that pattern. So in this series of graphs, we're looking at 2020 leading into 2021, out of 2021 into 2022, and then from there back into 2023. And we can see that prior to that period of high salinity, severe drought, we did have that sigmoidal relationship. Then going into 2021 and especially 2022, it never really happened. Then once again, high input of water, kind of the pattern resumes to its previous kind of steps of decreasing hatching, then following right back up, and at the end of 2023, back up into 91% hatching. If we then look at the current pattern, this is 2024. So from very high hatching outcome in February all the way down into the single digits beginning in July and carrying to just the sampling we did just quite recently, where it's down in the single digits. So that's a very different change. It's a very different kind of event that happened, and it was curious for us and provided some conditioning challenges for the cysts that were collected in 2021 and 2022. And so we did quite a bit of work altering a whole variety of hatching conditions, trying to understand if we have just a mixed population and how we can kind of take advantage of that. So we did things like vary conditions or capture the unhatched sitch and do a lot of analyses on those unhatched cysts under different conditions. And I think there's going to be a variety of different opinions of what happened, and probably many valid ones. One potential explanation among many others, I mean, there may be genetic reasons, epigenetic, behavioral, but one possibility is that during this time period of high salinity, low precipitation, we had very little flow from the north to the south. And so that deep brine layer dissipated. As the epilimnetic salinity approached that deep brine layer, we had almost just a uniform column throughout the water. Cysts that had been previously entrapped before that kind of dramatic chemocline and down in that deep brine layer, of which there were very high concentrations in the past, those are probably liberated into the upper water column. And it seems that fraction of cysts, at least to me, that their sort of biochemical behavior was reminiscent of some of Jim Clegg's work in the 1990s when he looked at anoxia-exposed cysts and kind of their hatching patterns. And just as a note, that deep brine layer, it was clearly an anoxic kind of highly reducing environment. So there may be some mixture of these anoxia-exposed cysts. The anoxia-exposed cysts typically have a different, maybe recalcitrant form of diapause. But now moving forward, getting into this one, these graphs are 2024 compared to 1994 to 2021, and things are in a sense back to normal. Spring hatching occurred earlier, then it goes through these kind of boom and bust population cycles of the population and primary production. And this year we're looking at what looks to be a fairly robust population. We're already at our highest number of reproductive females per liter for August compared to these other years. And also the number of females that are reproducing oviparously. Then the total reproductive output, again, these boom and bust cycles, which we have found over the years are favorable. There's primary production, then the Artemia overgraze it, Artemia population crashes, and the algal taxa rebound. The question there is, what is the rate of that recovery? And the rate of recovery of their primary production is generally a great indicator of what's going to happen to the Artemia population. And so, we kind of see this pattern where the biomass is there. We're seeing those boom and bust cycles. It all looks quite favorable. And so how did those high salinity years influence the overall harvest and then the cysts that were collected therein? It's a bit of an unfair comparison, but I start here with 2019 and go to 2023. 2019 was a banner year, 3,000 metric tons. This is dry yield. As we got it shifted into those drought years, that yield decreased down into the lowest at 2022 at 1,000. Then we have the high precipitation event of 2023 and a doubling of the production that year. And then the production in 2023, everything that we could assess, it was a very, very uniform population and it responds consistently to conditioning measures that we use typically for bringing out the best quality in our cysts. And that was, really a tremendous difference than those drought years. So when we do our sample collection on the lake, some of the analyses are not done in-house and we send them out, so there can be a lag period. This year, we're very interested in what happened with respect to nutrients because we have seen this rapid rate of primary production. And with that kind of rate, clearly bioavailable nutrients had to be there. And the reason that gives us, some degree of confidence in our effort in the past is we put a tremendous amount of work into cooperating with some of the sewer districts and ensuring that whatever means of getting nutrients and water back into the lake is taking place. And I think that's been effective. This year seems to indicate that the nutrients were available, primary production was rapid, and the Artemia response to it followed. So the top graph here is chlorophyll. We're looking at high levels, grazing event, rapid recovery, grazing event, followed again by rapid recovery. So this is indicating that the nutrients are there to support that primary production, and the Artemia population follows that pattern. So that's kind of it on the looking at how the Artemia did, how it responded to these rather stressful conditions and then to more favorable ones. But I do want to finish up, even though it's not my particular expertise, but finish up with just some comments on management. And with respect to management, there's been a lot of media press, ideas about a crisis that's taking place on the Great Salt Lake, and then heroes that come in and save the day. The reality of what's happened is there's 2.5 decades of very hard work, systematic work by a broad range of stakeholders, scientific organization, and people that are doing careful research, providing the foundation for resource managers to take care of the lake. And the tripod of support would be Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program, Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and Salinity Advisory Council. These kind of three programs or organizations are people that are doing the work, getting together and discussing what options we have so that when we're confronted with something like a so-called crisis with climate change, that we have this very diverse toolkit and a strong science-based system for addressing it. What's come out of that? What's come out of that, I think, is a great model of sustainable harvest management. And as I mentioned, a lot of work trying to ensure that we still get nutrients into the lake and maximizing the amount of water that's making it there. Then the next speaker, Phil Brown, will discuss all the details of managing salinity to the extent that we can in cooperation with Mother Nature. And some other things that have happened are at the policy and legislative level. And some really great bills have been passed. A lot has been done changing how we view water rights and water conservation. It's been very effective. I just have one bill that has passed here, HB 33, but there are many of them that have had a lot of benefit for the lake. And then money is following. So we have an example here, 2021, not a lot, $1 million put in. 1 year later, $375 million dedicated water conservation. Then this House Bill 157, it's a very good one. It guarantees that royalties from some of the lake's mineral extractions are going to support water in the lake. And then another $307 million for water conservation. And this is just a short list. There's a much larger list and a much larger list of House bills that have been passed. But nonetheless, what's happened is a different way of looking at water, a different way of looking at the rights of water and the allocation of that, and working cooperatively with the agricultural sector, which is by far the biggest user of water in Utah, to make sure the Great Salt Lake is getting its fair share. And then the public. In surveys on the public, there is more recognition of the value of the lake. So I think I could summarize and say it's successful. I think it really is a good model. It's very challenging. The weather is not something we can control. We just have to deal with it. But the cooperation that's happening in Utah, it's really, I think, been phenomenal. I mean, Utah is a state, and not to sound arrogant or bragging, but Utah is a state that's highly organized. And when people in Utah decide to do something, it's a pretty phenomenal coordinated output that happens. And so I think we could call this a success story, and by success, that a smaller volume lake down here, the South Arm, there are a lot of management tools that we can use. So just to kind of wrap it up. So a couple decades of very interesting weather, extremes of drought, extremes of precipitation, gave us an opportunity to look at how the lake responds to it. Now, it is at risk. It's at a very low volume. That is true. I think the ecosystem has responded quite well and demonstrated its resiliency, in particular the Artemia. And then, as I just mentioned, I think all this kind of foundational work of research and people who are completely dedicated to the lake, all of their efforts have come to fruition as the focus on the lake has really been generated by the stress of it. So we have a large cooperation of all these stakeholders. And maybe I'm being a naive optimist, but I think that the potential management of the lake in the face of these weather challenges, I think we're in a good position. So thanks for listening.
Yep. Thank you, Brad. Very impressive presentation, not only when it comes to the population dynamics, the hypothesis on the contribution of the deep cysts, interesting information. But the last few slides, well, last week in a meeting at FAO Rome, there was more time to go into the details, but this is really impressive what the state of Utah with the different stakeholders has accomplished over the past 25 years to save and see what the opportunities are of the future, but certainly also as an example, not necessarily to see it as a copy-paste, but as an example of approach at a different level, scientific, getting the policymakers, getting all the stakeholders involved.